Hello, welcome to Picture Me Coding with Eric Aker and Mike Mull. Hello, Mike.
Hey there.
In music news, I read an article this week that made me think of you. A guy named Brian Montana, who I didn't know of. He played for a band called The Possessed, lived in San Francisco. He actually died in a gun battle with police this week. He was credited with coming up with the name of the genre death metal, early 80s.
Yeah, I read the article. I know the band. I did not know the person.
Oh, yeah. It's a kind of a sad and crazy story. He got really enraged over his neighbor's yard trimmings. And so he started shooting at the neighbor's house, I guess. And then police showed up and he started shooting at police and then he died. 60 years old.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I relate to this far more than I probably should.
Do
Um,
you? That is unfortunate. But I don't think you own any. Do you own a bunch of guns?
I do not currently own any firearms,
Oh.
probably because I would start shooting at my neighbors if I did.
Where, which part of the story do you relate to? That does sound unfortunate. I thought, wow, this sounds like a mental health issue.
Yeah, very likely. But I have extremely annoying neighbors, and I can imagine getting upset about them over trees. So
Enough to start shooting at their houses.
probably not. Matter of degrees, I guess.
It's kind of it's a crazy story. I was pretty surprised when I read it. But anyway, this guy Brian Montana came up with the name death metal.
It's an interesting band that I think people should probably check out, but
Possessed.
not a happy story, which I guess is probably par for the course. Probably not a lot of upbeat death metal stories.
Have you been listening to stuff this week?
Yeah, the main thing I've been listening to is the new album from this band Model Actries. So we've been doing the podcast long enough now that this is the first time that I'm going to talk about a second album from the same band, because I talked about their album Dog's Body about a year ago.
Oh,
But
wow. That's a metal band, isn't it?
not exactly. They're kind of what they call a noise band. It's interesting because we just had this discussion recently about how I'm not a big fan of electronic music, which
Hmm.
kind of bums me out because I know a lot of people in our industry are big fans of electronic music. But
It doesn't bum me out because you know why? Just more for me, Mike. If you're not listening to it, there's more for me.
yeah, well, maybe you can talk about Aphex Twin someday. So this is kind of on the edge of electronic. Be totally normal to hear this in like a dance club or something, but
Hmm.
they also kind of don't sound like anybody else right now. It's very hard to music's very hard to describe, but I just really enjoy it, and it's kind of unique.
What's the name of the record?
It's called Pirouette.
Pirouette. And the name of the group, I can't picture the name. The second word sounds weird. It sounds like model actor, like Erlang, right? What's a
Yeah,
model actress? What is the
I don't
spelling of that?
know. I don't know what the origin of the name is, but it's model slash actrice instead of actress. It's actrice, um, like Spanishization of actress.
When you say electronic music and you say a lot of people out in the industry, I remember years ago, people who I associated with online friends, they were big Sigur Rós fans. What about Sigur Rós? Do they count? Is that electronic?
Um, I would probably say no, but I don't uh, I don't know how people who are into electronic music feel about that.
Okay. When you say electronic music, I think Square Pusher, Aphex Twin, stuff like that.
Yeah, I've worked with people who are super into the whole spectrum of the stuff, and they get very particular about the shades of it. Like, oh, this is synthwave or whatever.
Hmm.
I know it's like super popular among younger people, especially, and you know, I always hear about how young people don't listen to music with guitars anymore. It's all electronic and hip hop these days. But anyway, for some reason, it's just something that doesn't get like a substantial emotional reaction from me.
You never liked the Richard D. James album, Aphex Twin?
You've pointed me to it a couple of times, and I just, yeah, I will concede that it's a quality example of the genre. It just doesn't do much for me.
Hmm. Yeah, I don't know. Some of those weird sounds he gets out of those broken drum machines. Really gets me somewhere. So, Mike, you had a topic for us this week. You want to introduce it?
Yeah, so it's I'm not sure exactly what you would call this, but it's sort of a broad category of software that I've seen emerging over the last couple of years, which is called the local first software.
Mm-hmm.
I don't really remember where I saw it first. I know even when we were just starting the podcast, I remember thinking this might be an interesting topic to talk about someday. But
Mm-hmm.
in any case, the idea has been around now for, I don't know, 7 years, 8 years, something like that. And the the basic idea is it's kind of a contrast to the cloud native idea,
Mm-hmm.
so applications which are exclusively on the cloud and the front end is in a web browser.
I have to confess, you mentioned local first software a few times, and I had this naive response every time, which was like, "What's the big deal? I always write software locally. I don't before I deploy it. I don't understand what you're talking about. Local first, like, yeah, okay, I'm with you." And that was absolutely the wrong conception of what you were talking about. So you pointed me at this paper. The paper was published in 2019. It's published by ACM for a particular conference. I can't tell actually. Onward was the name of the conference. The paper is called "Local First Software: You Own Your Data in Spite of the Cloud," and the authors of the paper are Martin Klepman, Peter Van Hardenberg, Adam Wiggins, Mark McGranahan. And Peter Van Hardenberg, Adam Wiggins, Mark McGranahan are all associated with an organization called Ink and Switch. And Martin Klepman, who we know, who we talked about his work in the past, he's a professor of computer science at the University of Cambridge. And he wrote Designing Data Intensive Applications, one of our favorite books, one of our favorite technical books. So I started
Indeed.
reading this paper you pointed me to, and I was like, whoa, I had absolutely the wrong idea about what you were talking about with local first. This paper is rad. It's super readable. If you're listening to us, it's as readable as any technical blog post you might encounter. You got to give this a try, listeners. Go out and read this paper. We'll include a link to it. It's a great paper. It's super fun to read, and I found it super inspiring. And I was like, this is cool. What are we going to build, Mike?
Yeah, that was kind of my initial reaction. I have to admit, there's like a part of me also that since I sort of started out in the personal computer era, I think there's a part of me that to which this appeals because of the fact that it puts a little bit more focus back on your personal computer.
Mm-hmm.
But it
Yeah,
is not.
ownership. Yeah.
It is not, however, like some sort of regression to a former time.
Mm-hmm.
It's just a different way of building software, which focuses more on keeping your data local.
Yeah, it's not like a pastiche. Let's talk about the paper a little bit. I think that'd be a good way to organize our discussion. But then I want to talk about the paper came out in 2019. So what's happened since then? How successful has this been? What exists out there? So here's a note from the abstract for the paper. In this article, we propose local first software, a set of principles for software that enables both collaboration and ownership for users. Local first ideals include the ability to work offline and collaborate across multiple devices while also improving the security, privacy, long term preservation, and user control of data. So they start by describing these so called, and I'm going to put this in quotes here, cloud apps. They talk about cloud apps, and they contrast these with old fashioned apps, also in quotes. Cloud apps is the name they give to stuff we pay subscription fees to use, where our data is hosted on a server somewhere. Mike, you and I could be accused of building so called cloud apps. Like, that's all I've ever built is a cloud app.
Yeah, I guess almost everything which is software as a service is in this category. There's, I guess, a few shades which we will probably talk about in here eventually, but there are some things which have a sort of local first flavor, but which are also, thought of as being pretty significant cloud apps. I guess, things like Dropbox, for instance. But
Hmm. Well, the contrast to old fashioned apps I found really interesting too. They talk about old fashioned apps as like these appliances almost that would run forever. It reminded me of like the vacuum your grandmother has that never dies and you keep repairing. Maybe they're a bit clunky, You could run an app like this on one machine only, but it doesn't promote. This is the downside. They say it doesn't promote sharing and collaboration. So they give a few examples: text editors and IDEs is an old-fashioned app. Git, surprisingly, old-fashioned app example, and graphics applications CAD, stuff that you run natively on your machine. You don't think of these as something that runs in the cloud first and foremost. Here's a description from the paper. This is a quote. In old fashioned apps, the data lives in files on your local disk, so you have full agency and ownership of that data. You could do anything you like, including long term archiving, making backups, manipulating the files, using other programs, or deleting the files if you no longer want them. You don't need anybody's permission to access your files since they are yours. You don't have to depend on servers operated by another company. And they even talk about how, like, you could run this stuff as long as you want. Really, maybe maybe the company that produced the software originally goes away. You've got the files. You can even maybe you've got an emulator or something. That's pretty cool. This is what spoke to you.
Yeah, and of course, if you're not an old like me, you probably don't remember the heady days of the PC world where this was a big deal because prior to personal computers, most work was done on mainframes or mini computers, and you would access them through VT100 terminals or whatever. And
Mhm.
so the idea that you could do your computing locally and you know maintain your own data and stuff like that was actually pretty revolutionary. And now it's old fashioned.
Everything new is old again, Mike. So they contrast this with the cloud apps. I think this will sound familiar to most of our listeners. We can probably give dozens of examples of things that any of us would interact with that they would call a cloud app. So they say these apps, they promote sharing and collaboration, but they do not promote ownership of your data. So you're renting the ability to use these apps. And if they shut down, they take all your work with them. So they give a lot of examples. They give a handful of examples, but there are loads. The things that came to mind for me: Confluence, a documentation app. We build these beautiful markdown Confluence docs at work, and you end up with this mountain of information that you kind of think, wow, if Confluence goes away, there it goes. Squarespace is one that people are building websites on Squarespace. I've never used Squarespace. Actually, I think I helped somebody once set up a Squarespace site. But you can imagine, like, if that goes away, it's like it's all gone. Trello for working, managing your tracking work you want to do. Figma for design. Slack. Can you imagine trying to keep track of a mountain of Slack conversations? Spotify. Here's one you and I use a lot. If you make really big Spotify playlists and Spotify goes away, no, they're probably not in danger to go away, but it's like maybe they offered some way to download those playlists, but what would you do with that download? You'd need some way to render it into an interesting list of the music that you care about.
That's an interesting one to me though, because it's only been like 20 years since people were downloading MP3s and putting them onto portable players, and we all had music players on our desktops and stuff like that.
Winamp. Yeah, I
Winamp,
used to
yeah.
Winamp, and people used to have those crazy Winamp screens. Yeah, it's a lot of work. Remember, I mean, the mixtape was a labor of love. The mixtape was a creative act. So in the paper, they say this all hinges on the effort, the labor that goes into creative acts. They write, when you've put a lot of creative energy and effort into making something, you tend to have a deep emotional attachment to it. If you do creative work, this probably seems familiar. When we say, quote, creative work, we mean not just visual art or music or poetry, many other activities, such as explaining a technical topic, implementing an intricate algorithm, designing a user interface, or figuring out how to lead a team towards some goal are also creative efforts. I was kind of curious to get your take on this, that they're talking about creative effort as one of the motivators for this. Did that surprise you?
Not entirely. One angle that occurs to me on this too is like scientific collaboration.
Hmm.
So, what's happened a lot in scientific collaboration, and I guess to a certain extent in the industrial world too, is that you'll do an experiment or you'll do some simulation or something, and you'll create this data set and then you'll like sneaker net it to somebody else or put it on a thumb drive, and then they have a copy of this data set. And so there's been a tendency over the last couple of decades of trying to, put commonly used things into repositories. There's issues with that too. So there's kind of this tension between. So I think of creating these scientific data sets as being a creative endeavor, but there's a sort of this tension between the creative process and also trying to keep control of the contents of what you're making and making sure it's not diverging and being manipulated. Like you don't want experimental data to be edited, for instance.
That's interesting. So there's almost a call to arms you have in there. Listeners, go out and build a peer-to-peer scientific data set sharing service. That would be a huge service to the world, wouldn't it?
I think so, yes.
So the authors of the paper, Kleppmann et al., they say we produce, this is not a quote, but I'm kind of paraphrasing here. They're saying we make a lot of data when we're doing creative work, and we usually want to keep the data. And you give an example of scientific data sets. They write, now this is a quote, it's important to feel ownership of that data because a creative expression is something so personal. I found it interesting that this is how they ground it, right? Their motivation is like, we want to own the data. We have a personal stake in it when we're doing these creative acts. They're not just purely talking about software. They're not just purely talking about data. They're not just saying, hey, you have this data you care about. Maybe it's financial data or whatever. There's stuff that you're doing, and data is an output or maybe a side effect of your effort. And you want that. You want to keep it, even if it's something trivial like a Spotify playlist. A funny thing happened when I read this passage. Maybe 10 or 20 years ago, I remember every time I would join some new service, I would think about how much effort it was going to be to set it up and how much of that labor would go up like into some meaningless poof of smoke if I stopped using the service. I remember first joining Spotify and thinking, ugh, I got to create playlists again. That sucks. And I'm still really lazy with Spotify, and I tend to just cram everything in like one play. Like, hey, this is what I'm listening to right now. I'm listening to right now playlist, which is actually called Picture Me Coding, which is actually the source of the name of the show. Did you ever have that feeling where you like, oh, I got to do effort to use another new service? That sounds like a drag.
Yeah, especially with music, that's been an issue for me over the years because being a music nerd, I have gone from the days when I was making cassette tapes from vinyl albums up to the point of now carefully curating my Spotify lists and buying things on Bandcamp and so forth. So
Mm-hmm.
I've just sort of conceded that it's not something that I'm ever going to, like, at some point in time I'm going to pass on from this world and nobody's going to care about my Spotify list, so I don't need to
Hmm.
worry about like treating it like a museum.
But the company cares. I think my initial reaction to these SaaS services, and I don't mean this as some sort of devastating critique, but it was just sort of this like almost childish feeling I had like I'm giving you all this effort for free. Like you set up this service, okay, and I go in there and I start using it and I got to do a bunch of work. And what do I get out of it? Yeah, I get to use your service. I get to pay you to use your service, but I'm going to do a lot of work to be able to use your service. That kind of sucks a little bit, right? Wouldn't it be? I should be more magical. I should have to do nothing. I should just sit on the couch and click the button on a remote, and I pay them money, and the stuff happens. Anyway, the authors of the paper, they write that cloud apps allow us to collaborate. They give us collaboration. They give us sharing, but they don't give us ownership of the data. Old-fashioned apps give us ownership of the data, and ideally we'd have both. And so that's what they're saying local first software is all about.
So the basic idea is that the data is on your machine, on the same machine where the UI is running, but you can also collaborate with other people. So it's local first, but it's not local only like the old-fashioned apps. I'm going to read something from the paper here. We believe that data ownership and real-time collaboration are not at odds with each other. It is possible to create software that has all the advantages of cloud apps while also allowing you to retain full ownership of the data, documents, and files you create. We
Hmm.
call this type of software local first software since it prioritizes the use of local storage and local networks.
Yeah, I don't know if I really like the name Local First, but I don't have a better one. Local First because I initially stupidly thought it was like I'm building software locally. That's not what this is about. It's about owning the files, the data, the output of your labor exists locally, and you could do whatever you want with it, but you can also still share and collaborate. Now, how do they make that work?
So, an example of this, which kind of fits what they're talking about, which has been around for a while, is Dropbox. It's not exactly what they mean because it's not peer to peer, but Dropbox has this model where you have files on your machine and they're sort of transparently synced up to a, a cloud storage option, so you can share those files with other people. Other people
Hmm.
can modify them and so forth. But if the network goes away, your files are still on your machine. You haven't lost access to them. Or if Dropbox decides to go out of business for some reason, you still have your files.
You said it's not exactly what they mean because it's not peer to peer. I wasn't sure reading the paper if it had to be peer to peer. It just seemed like peer to peer was a model of communication that these apps can use. What do you think? I mean, they have these seven principles. Maybe we should talk about seven principles. I guess let's talk about seven principles.
Yeah, I think there's multiple architectures that sort of fit into what they're talking about, but I think the key thing is that they sort of match these seven principles that they list in the paper.
Yeah, they call them seven ideals. They say, okay, so we have this definition, local first software. It's prioritizing local first, so you own the data, but we're not getting in the way of sharing and collaboration, which is the kind of revolutionary cool thing that you get from these cloud apps, right? And they say there's seven ideals to producing these, and I'll just list them real quick. No spinners. That means it's like immediate when you work on the app. Your work is not trapped on one device. That was the problem they said about old fashioned. The network is optional. That's interesting. You don't need a network to actually use an app here. Seamless collaboration with your colleagues. There's the collaboration word. The long now. Did that one make sense to you?
Um, I think it's one of the more tricky ones in this list, but the basic idea I think there is that the data, there's not some point in the future where the data becomes unusable because the application that requires it is no longer in your control. I think they talk about this a little bit in the paper, and it still seems like to me that it's going to be hard to achieve because
Mm.
at some point you have to start running things on emulators, and so
Hmm.
you're
Hmm.
you're dependent on emulators existing. But
You'd have to pick a data format that you can see into the future is going to be used for a very long time. But if you did that, you could write an app that serializes data locally to disk in a format that's readable by the person running the software and usable for the next 50 years, 100 years, something like that. They said something like there are so many JPEGs and GIFs out there that it's going to be hundreds of years that people can read these files. And I was like, really? You're saying my favorite sad parrot animated GIF is going to be readable and reproducible on a computer for hundreds of years? Ah, a lot different than looking at the Dome of Florence.
so where were we?
So, all right. So we got five. No spinners. Your work is not trapped on one device. The network is optional. Seamless collaboration. The long now. That's where we stop there. And then the last two are security and privacy by default. That sounds pretty cool. And you retain ultimate ownership and control. So you have freedom to do whatever you want with your data. Which of those stand out to you of the seven?
Probably the first two and the last one are
Hmm.
the ones that sort
Ownership
of
and
appeal
control.
to me.
Yeah, no spinners. Very fast, immediate, and your work is not trapped on your device. Those appealed to me too. I also thought security privacy sounds cool. They were like, if we're going to allow collaboration and sharing, which is one of the ideals, you could go through servers, but because the data is primarily a local first idea, you could just encrypt it end to end. So if I'm like working on a budgeting app, I've got my finances on my machine. I want to have a shared budget with you. Well, I could encrypt that. It can go through a server. It can land on your machine. That server never decrypts it, doesn't have the keys to decrypt it. It actually can't read the data. That's pretty rad, actually. It does limit the company's ability to market to us, right? They're like, wow, Mike and Eric are spending a lot of time at the grocery store. Let's send them weekly deals.
Yeah, which I guess should be principle 8.
I guess the app could do that. If I'm running the app, it could have ads embedded on it locally. Anyway, so the collaboration one, I think, was the one that kind of I was least excited about. This is another dumb response that I have, but I'm sort of less excited about collaboration. Too much collaboration, Mike. Can I just work on stuff by myself?
I think, though, that this is sort of one of the key aspects of the local first idea, is that if you are working on a joint document, it's possible to do that without centralizing the data.
Local Google Docs and such. Does building web apps kind of presuppose that we're not doing this? I've built a lot of web apps in my career. Can I not build web apps anymore if I'm doing local first?
Well, I think there is certainly a sense in which web apps are kind of in a contrary direction to what they're proposing with local first. But so we'll talk about some of the technologies used here in a few minutes. But I've seen some web app approaches where they are sort of using some of these ideas that are common in local first to actually build web apps. So there's this kind of idea. There's a thing called a sync engine, and I've heard this idea of people talking about, you have a database on your client too. So, you have a web app, but on your client end in your web browser, you also have access to a database, and that database is essentially syncing itself with the database on the back end. And so I think there's at least some local first principles that could be applied to web apps. It's arguable whether or not that's still local first, but it has sort of the flavor of it.
So, not necessarily. Web apps aren't necessarily in opposition to this. Technical difficulties. How do we do this? Sharing and collaboration are quite a lot easier if you just ship everything to the cloud service. And then as soon as you start working, you download what you need from the cloud service and you ship everything back. Very chatty app. So the second half of the paper talks about how do you do this for software primarily meant to run on individual machines. Section 3, they say, here's what exists now to make an app like this possible. And section 4 is like, here's what should exist in the future, what we should work towards. How did you, when you're reading this paper, did you have the same question I had? It was like, okay, but how do we pull, this sounds cool. I want to build something. How do we do it? How do we pull this off?
I think, yeah, I mean, when you first hear it, you're like, well, that does sound cool. I wish we could do that, but that's got to be pretty hard, right? So one thing that's interesting about local first is that there are certain technologies that are very much associated with the phenomenon.
This paper has some great tables and images and graphs in it. You got to read this paper. It's a good paper. It's easy to read. It's fun to read. You got to read it. It'll inspire you. They have this table in section 3 where they say, here's our 7 ideals, the ones we just talked about, and here are existing technologies. And then they have like good, green check mark, medium, yellow bar, bad, red circle, meaning how well does it achieve that particular of the 7 ideals? And then they compare all these existing technologies. They talk about Dropbox and Google Docs and even local files and Git and GitHub. Nothing in the table gets green check marks for all 7 ideals, but Git and GitHub comes closest. And I was sort of surprised and not surprised by that. But I just found it funny that a software development tool, maybe ironically, is what comes closest to satisfying what these software developers are saying we should aspire to.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good. It's not what springs to mind for me either, but if you think about it, it is a good example because you are collaborating on documents. Multiple people can collaborate on them at the same time, and yet you can bring a copy of those documents totally to your local system and essentially have control over them.
And you're primarily using your local system to edit those.
And if the network goes away, you lose access to updates to them, but you don't lose access to the files. Of course, the downside with GitHub is that it's not really an interactive thing like Google Docs or Figma.
They say, we think, this is a quote, we think the Git model points the way toward a future for local first software. So this is a model for what we can build. However, as it currently stands, Git has two major weaknesses. They say, number one, it's excellent for async collaboration, especially using pull requests, but it has no capability for real-time, fine-grained collaboration, such as the instantaneous merging, automatic instantaneous merging that occurs in tools like Google Docs, Trello, and Figma. So that's one problem. And it's also, number two, they say, highly optimized for code in similar line-based text files. Other file formats are treated as binary blobs that can't be meaningfully edited or merged. So two problems: async collaboration, really text files only. So these are limitations for it. But I also, when I'm reading the paper, Mike, I'm thinking, but we're not just talking about like file collaboration, right? Aren't there other things I'd want to collaborate on potentially or share with you, even communication systems?
I guess I would need an example there that doesn't fit into the document model. I can see wanting to collaborate on things that are not code, but the things that I'm imagining are text documents and charts and graphs and spreadsheet data, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I guess my question is less about collaboration and more about sharing. I think the emphasis on collaboration is kind of the turn in the road. I want to keep going down the straight path of the road where this idea goes, and there keep being these signs saying, "Hey, turn off here for collaboration," and I keep going. No, no, no. I'm going to keep driving. There's a passage in here I thought was really telling. I want to read it. It's about IDEs and text editors. It's interesting to note, they write, that most software engineers have been reluctant to embrace cloud software for their editors, IDEs, runtime environments, and build tools. In theory, we might expect this demographic of sophisticated users to embrace newer technologies sooner than other types of users. But if you ask an engineer why they don't use a cloud based editor, the answers will usually include it's too slow, or I don't trust it, or I want my code on my local system. These sentiments seem to reflect some of the same motivations as local first software. If we as developers want these things for ourselves and our work, perhaps we might imagine that other types of creative professionals would want these same qualities for their own work. What do you think?
Yeah, I thought that was an interesting comment too. I wasn't entirely sure that this is maybe not just a generational thing. So like
Oh,
people who've grown up in the industry doing things this way are reluctant to switch away from it, and maybe people starting now, they're more willing to try things like Google Spaces or whatever, or GitHub Spaces, sorry.
you dev containers, that
Yeah. But
workspaces.
I definitely feel this way, and I think it is sort of this is sort of the way most people in the industry feel. So it
Oh,
is.
I absolutely feel this way. Yeah. It feels gross to imagine doing software development on someone else's machine in the cloud. I want instantaneous feedback. Maybe that's it's too slow. I want my own protected little sandbox where I can set stuff up exactly as I want and I can make mistakes freely. I can break things. I can do weird stuff. I could try to get it to crash or segfault. I was working with a segfault in Python a couple weeks ago, and I was like, "Ooh, this is rad! I got it to segfault." So I just played with that for a few hours. I want to be able to do that on my local machine, my little sandbox, my little protected corner of the world. But their critique, it kind of hits me a little bit. Whoa, are we being jerks here by not extending the same, assuming that others would want the same for their own creative work?
Yeah, and especially in this day and age where authors and artists are essentially having their work co-opted for,
Mm.
you know, generative AI.
Yeah, can you imagine? Hey, I've got this great painting app, but you've got to put it all on the servers, and oh yeah, we're gonna view all of your stuff and train our model with it, so you won't even need to produce it in the future. Doesn't that sound great?
Yeah, it's very much like the you can still develop software, you just won't need to code anymore arguments
Yeah.
that bug me so much. So
So, Mike, let's say we wanted to build one of these local first apps. I'm just gonna, off the top of my head, we're gonna build an app where you and I can share with each other Spotify playlists or music playlists, maybe not Spotify playlists, music playlists, tide pool photos, and I don't know, to do lists, code. So I've
bird
got some,
songs, bird songs.
Birds. So I've got some text things. I was trying to have multimedia in there. How do we do this? Do we need to first build like a peer-to-peer networking system for us to be able to do this? That sounds like we're never going to make any progress.
I don't think we need to build it, fortunately. There are a couple of technologies that are very deeply associated with the local first style of software. So one interesting thing, which will probably surprise no one if you've listened to the podcast before, but it turns out that local first software is essentially a distributed systems problem. But one of the key technologies involved here is what are called CRDTs. CRDT stands for conflict-free replicated data types. This is an idea that's been around for, I don't know, 15 years, something like that?
I think something like that, yeah.
Basically, the idea here is that you have these data types and you can update values, and there's sort of a precise interface and a precise definition about how various updates get applied.
Mm-hmm.
And also that, they are in effect commutative. So the order in which they are applied usually doesn't matter.
Yes, it's like a data structure. It's a data structure you can imagine on a whole bunch of different machines. And when changes happen on one machine, those changes can be replicated to the other machines in a safe, reliable way. Conflict free sounds great, right in the name there, Mike. From what I've read in the past, there are two types of CRDTs. There's state-based and operation-based. I think, and I might get this wrong because I'm just sort of freely recalling. State-based is like I have the entire state of whatever we're keeping track of, and whenever something changes, I apply that change, and then I tell everybody else, all the other servers, hey, this is my version of the state. And then there's operation-based, which is where you record a set of operations, sort of like in an event sourcing database. So you say, hey, this thing changed, and I have a record of that change, and then my version of the state is all of those changes being applied. I think I don't know if there's any, I think those are the two that I've heard of.
So you can sort of see how these fit into the local first model, because, you can make changes locally, and if you're not connected by the network when you're making those changes, once you do get reconnected, the changes can be propagated to other places and applied there. And of course, kind of like Git, there is the possibility of having conflicting changes, which you have to sort of look at and decide how to deal with. But for the most part, this is, the idea here is it's a way to apply changes to a document that is not centralized, but where the changes can be propagated between two machines.
In the paper, they talk about CRDTs a bit for a while, actually, and they're like, this is one way to achieve these goals for your software application. And they do make that comparison to Git, like you said. They write, the only type of change a CRDT cannot automatically resolve is when multiple users concurrently update the same property of the same object. So we keep track of the conflicting values and we let people figure them out. Hey, let the users deal with it. So that's one of the technologies we can rely on. Did you end up, I was surprised to discover, looking at this work, there's a website, there's a conference, there's a podcast. I listened to a handful of episodes of the podcast. There's a company, Ink and Switch. There is a GitHub repo called Awesome Local First, and there's other curated lists of local first software.
Yeah, there's quite a bit of a community around this already, although I think it's kind of concentrated in Germany. One system that comes up quite a bit in conversations about local first is AutoMerge, which is a CRDT library that was, I believe, started by Martin Kleppmann. Was originally JavaScript, and now I believe there's a Rust version.
There's a Rust CRDTs library that I always want to find an excuse to use, but I haven't used it yet. I don't think it's AutoMerge, though. I think it's different. I think it's just called CRDTs, or what is it called?
Yeah, Rust CRDT. That's right.
Rust CRDTs. Yeah. Kleppmann's not. That's not his, is it? No.
No, I believe that's different than AutoMerge.
Oh, okay. Where do you think this project is at now, Local First Software? Do you think this is, I mean, the paper came out in 2019. Do you think it's been successful? Are there examples that we can point to? Are they pulling it off?
I think so. I mean, clearly it has not supplanted the software as a service model. And of course, 99.9% of the entire industry's focus is on Gen AI these days.
Hmm.
But, Ink and Switch, this company, which kind of gave us the name Local First, has been doing a lot of experiments with this type of software. And I think they've kind of proved its viability through the apps that they've built. And there are some companies also that are using these approaches who are, having some success in the marketplace and attracting a fair amount of venture capital.
Because the question immediately comes up, is anybody going to make money on this? If you don't make money on it, can you hire people to work on it? It's dead in the water if you can't make money on it.
Yeah, people apparently are making money on it, and there are some successful products out there already.
What do you think? This appeals to me, this paper. I read it and I did feel directly inspired. And I did feel like this sounds cool. I want to build something. What is it that appeals to us about this?
Yeah, it's hard to put a finger on. I think, for me personally, there's a little bit of a nostalgia in the idea of kind of moving some focus back on the personal computer. I sometimes am amused by the fact that I have this, my main computer that I work on is a MacBook Air with an M2 processor, and it's got 8 cores and GPUs and 28 gigabytes of memory, and it seems silly to use it primarily to browse the web. It's
Hmm.
just, it's more powerful than the Craze that I worked on when I was starting my career, but we end up using these machines primarily for looking up sports scores and reading Reddit and stuff like that,
Playing music.
playing music. So I like the idea that it sort of brings some of the focus back to the personal computer and trying to use those, local platforms, both your computer and your phone and that kind of thing. And it's verging on a political thing, but I do like the idea of having ownership of the data, having control of the data,
I like that too.
not losing access to it when somebody decides that you shouldn't see it anymore.
Yeah, I like the idea of end-to-end encryption. I can work on a thing, I can share it with you. I don't need some giant company browsing inside the thing to see what to sell me ads for. but that's the only business model that exists apparently, so I don't know. Who's going to want to spend all the effort to build the thing that I want to use to share with you?
What you need is kind of like the case where local first is clearly better than the software as a service model, so that you can
Hmm.
justify spending the money on it. But my personal feeling is that there is enough momentum here and enough people interested in it that this is probably going to be around for a while and catch on.
I gotta say that I was inspired, but the good stuff didn't. That so they give some examples of prototypes that were built. They say there's this is these are ink and switch prototypes. Trellis is a Kanban board. There's a tool they built called Pixel Pusher, which is a collaborative drawing tool. Pushpin is a media canvas like Miro, where you can pin all kinds of stuff and say this is a grouping of ideas. And they give here are the good and bad of building these things. Good offline is works great. That's cool. CRDTs work, they say. Dev experience is okay for if you're using function reactive programming. I don't think we have a lot of time to get into that, but it's the idea that you make a change and then the view state reacts based on state changes over time. And they say that conflicts don't appear to be such a huge deal. Those good points are all like, oh, okay, those are kind of good. I like the ideals more than those good things. They say here are the bad things. You're always simultaneously offline and online. And so it's hard to reason about data moving around. The CRDTs, they get really big over time. They accumulate these large change histories. You still do need some cloud servers to facilitate the sharing, right? The data has to go there to be able to make it to your machine. And then finally, network communication, they write, quote, remains an unsolved problem. That last one surprised me. I was like, wait a minute, what are you talking about? And then I realized, oh, it's like my laptop's behind a router. It's being NATed as a client, as a dumb client using a SaaS app. It's requesting stuff from a central server, but it'd be nice to identify it as a node on my whole network for a local first app. And that's going to be pretty hard. So you do go immediately to like peer to peer, BitTorrent, stuff like that. And they say the use of P2P technologies at our prototypes as well yielded mixed results. On one hand, these technologies are nowhere near production ready. NAT traversal in particular is unreliable, depending on the particular router or network topology where the user is currently connected. NAT, if you're unfamiliar, the idea is my machine goes out to the public network through a router. That router keeps track of within our network, the machine the request originated from. But the public network, a server that's way out there on the other side of that wall, it doesn't know anything about my machine. It just sees the IP address of requests originating from my router, right? So that's kind of a problem. They say the promise suggested by P2P protocols, decentralized web communities, substantial live collaboration between computers without internet access feels like magic in a world that has come to depend on centralized APIs. So here's what I'm getting to, Mike. I read the good, I'm like, oh, those are okay. I read the bad, and I think, that sounds hard. I don't know if I really want to go in that direction. What do you think?
Again, I think it depends on the application. There's some things which are clearly always going to be in the cloud. I think now, you're probably not going to see like a local first version of Apache Spark or something like that.
Hmm.
You can run Apache Spark on a local machine, but if you've got 20 terabytes of data, you're probably not going to, you know, depend on your friends to let them use your compute resource to do a MapReduce job or something.
Mm-hmm.
But the sort of commercial apps that seem to be working in this space are things like, like the sort of project management and collaboration things. The classic example in our industry being Jira. Jira is this sort of the 800-pound gorilla of the agile world, and it's
You
all
raised the
cloud.
name Jira. I feel like I'm going to hiss at it, but go ahead. Sorry.
It's all cloud based, but really doesn't need to be. It's something that can be moved into a local first model, and there's this company called Linear, which is doing just that thing, and they have had a considerable amount of success, both in terms of attracting investment and selling it to the marketplace.
There were a couple apps listed in the awesome curated list of local first. The two that stood out to me, three that stood out to me. One was a budgeting app called Actual Budget. It sounded really cool. It's open source. It's a budgeting app you can share and collaborate on with other people. It's end to end encrypted. And I got to say, I looked at their website, and I have this problem these days where when I go to a software project's website and the website looks a certain level of fancy enough, it's not just read the docs. I think to myself, okay, what are you trying to sell me? Affine app is like a media sharing app where you can like coordinate, organize ideas, kind of like a Figma thing, I think. And that makes sense to me. You go to their fancy website and there's a pricing tab, exactly what I'd expect to see. You're charging for this. But Actual Budget confuses me. The website looks way too nice. Are they giving this away for free? I don't get it. In any case, I want to try to use it.
There's another one called Superhuman, which is an email app, and I think that's another case where I can certainly see that being both technologically plausible and also having some benefit over using Gmail or another cloud-based thing where there's always a little bit of a concern that they're reading your emails, even if it's only to put ads in front of you.
Yeah. I mean, Gmail's not going to go away, but can you imagine if it did? The history that you would have in there that you would lose access to?
Yeah, and the other thing that Google as a whole sort of traps you into is, they give you a certain amount of storage, and they make it convenient for you to use their email client, and they make it convenient for you to put photos in on the cloud because of, like I have a Pixel phone. But then you reach this point where they're like, "Hey, you're pretty close to exceeding your storage.
Yeah.
You should pay us now for more storage." And so you're paying for 100 gigabytes of storage, which is nothing on a local machine now. You can easily get terabytes of disk on a local machine now. So
Hmm. The Awesome app had a link to a peer-to-peer social media network. And I thought, whoa, that makes a ton of sense. That's a cool idea. It's called Secure Scuttlebutt. I would be surprised if something like this really took off because it seems like you probably need technical knowledge just to get your foot in the door. But it definitely sounded like a great idea.
Yeah, I wonder about that one. I see people talking on Blue Sky about, running their own Blue Sky nodes and their own Mastodon nodes and stuff like that, and how much they pay for them and things like that. And that seems like something that's going to be pretty confined to the nerd community. But
Hmm.
I'm not totally skeptical that there's somebody out there who could figure out a way to make that a commercial proposition.
I mean, if you could run an app on your phone, on your machine, that you're just talking to your peers, people you know, friends, acquaintances, if that group were big enough, I don't necessarily need a massive aggregation. I don't need the public, the town square of the internet. I don't really, maybe I'm a weirdo. I don't really want that. I don't really want to be in the town square of the internet. I just want to talk to a few hundred people who I have talked to for years. Some of them, maybe new people come and go. That's fine. The idea of a peer to peer social network really appeals to me for that reason.
I think there's also possibly like a better model there for sort of levels of trust. Like you're going to have people that you are comfortable sharing things with easily, and there's going to be other people who you mostly follow and maybe
Hmm.
occasionally respond to. But I could see a local first social media platform that was more like had like different levels of trust for different types of friends.
Hmm. So I read this paper. I felt inspired. I've said that a few times. I really did. It was exciting to me to read a paper like that like fired me up and gave me that feeling of, Mike, let's build a thing. At the end of the paper, they write, how can you help? They give different answers for different audiences. So if you're a researcher in distributed systems, you can do this. They say, if you're a software engineer, a designer, a product manager, or independent app developer working on production ready software today, how can you help? We suggest taking incremental steps toward a local first future. Start by scoring your app according to the ideals in section 2. And I read that and I was like, oh, I like they have this how can you help section. But then the answer for me is start by scoring your app. I was like, I don't want to do that. I want to build something. Let's build something fun.
They mention, I think they call it Firebase for CRDTs in the paper as well. Somebody needs to build Firebase for CRDTs, which might be a fun project to work on.
Set the LLMs on that project, Mike. What are we going to do?
I think there are a lot of interesting, to me at least, distributed systems problems in here.
Mm-hmm.
CRDTs in general, I think, are an interesting concept, and the ways, like one of the things they talk about in the paper is, say you have a document collaboration thing or like a drawing thing like Figma or something like that. How do you deal in real time with the potential changes to the potential conflicts? The sort of GitHub merge approach doesn't seem like a good thing for interactive apps like that, but there's probably some more clever way to interact with humans and resolve those conflicts.
Okay. Okay. Well, I'm going to pitch an app to you that we can start building this weekend. My app is collaborative whiteboarding. I haven't seen a collaborative whiteboarding tool that I've really liked. And I think the reason is you give people too many paintbrushes and they sort of, it becomes hard to figure out how to proceed. It's like, I got to learn how to use this tool. So Mike, my suggestion is you and we build a collaborative whiteboarding tool, except you only get one thing you can draw: arrows.
And every time you make an arrow, you have to do push-ups, right?
You can make the arrows as big or as small as you want. You can't draw circles or boxes. If you want a circle or a box, you will have to construct that out of smaller arrows.
uh, how about maybe nodes and arrows?
Too
Too much.
complex. Think about how basic our CRDT will be. It's just, this is a list of the arrows in Eric's diagram, and Mike wants to put these arrows in the diagram. And just metaphorically, it makes so much sense to me that really all we're doing is just drawing a whole bunch of arrows.
That sounds hard. I mean, it probably simplifies the infrastructure a little bit to only draw arrows, but I'm having a hard time imagining what I construct out of only arrows. Can I connect
So
the arrows? Like, can I
yes,
connect the
yes,
tail to the head? Okay,
yes,
that
yeah.
helps at least.
You could put the arrows together however you want. And the name of the app, beautifully, simply, prosaically, only arrows.
It's evocative.
So, local first software friends, go out and read the paper. I recommend it. If you would like to support our show, we are on Patreon. You can become a Patreon subscriber for $4 a month. This is the cost of a cup of coffee for Mike and I. We will share one cup happily, $4 a month, and you can support our show, and it will go to the cost of hosting and producing the show. In addition, if you'd like to reach out to us, please send us an email, podcast@picturemecoding.com. And you can reach us on Blue Sky, Picture Me Coding. This has been Picture Me Coding with Eric Aker and Mike Mull. Thanks so much for listening.
See you next time.